The doctors had no other choice but to put Britta in an artificial coma if she and her husband Matthew wanted to have the best chance at giving birth to a healthy son. But with all the risks associated with this, Matthew could not help being nervous. Luckily, everything seemed to have gone great, but 2 months later, everything suddenly changed. The doctors simply could not believe what they discovered. Matthew really thought that the worst was behind him and his family. His son was finally born in seemingly good health and his wife Britta was out of her coma. But 2 months after their son was born, Matthew got a worrying call from their doctor. They needed to get to the hospital immediately. While Matthew's heart was racing, Britta was strangely calm, like she knew exactly what was going to happen. At the hospital, Britta needed to do a couple tests while Matthew nervously waited. After the results of the tests came back, the doctors could barely believe it. They were almost afraid to share these results with the family, as they would have a hard time believing they were accurate. But what was going on with Britta? And why did she have to give birth in a coma? Matthew was brought to a small office on the floor above by one of the nurses, where 2 doctors were awaiting him. When they explained to the man the situation his wife was in, as well as the news of what was about to happen, Matthew nearly passed out. The pregnancy had not been smooth sailing so far, but he could never have guessed it had gotten this bad. If his wife Britta and his soon-to-be-born baby boy were to have any chance of surviving this ordeal, she would have to be put in an artificial coma. Britta's brain in a temporary hibernation would be their best chance towards success, according to the doctors. However, it was Matthew that needed to agree to this before they could proceed. Under normal circumstances, they would ask the patient that was about to be put in a coma for their consent. But at this point, Britta was not in a state anymore in which she could make a thoughtful decision. She was weakened as well as given a lot of morphine to ease her pain. Therefore, it was now up to Britta's husband to make the decision. To Matthew, this came rough. It was as if the doctors were presenting to him a decision between life and death. It quickly became clear to him that there was not much of a choice. The doctors assured the man that this procedure would be safe, so who was he to doubt their judgment? He eventually agreed that Britta would have to be put in a coma. Matthew asked for one favor, though. He wanted nothing more than to be in the room when the execution would begin. Strictly, this was against procedures, but the team decided to allow it. Matthew held his wife's hand as the doctor put her in a deep sleep. They assured Matthew once more that she would wake up again, but Matthew could not help but be worried. At first, Matthew felt a strong grip of his beloved and very pregnant wife on his hand, but with the seconds ticking away, he could feel this grip getting weaker. This broke his heart, and at the same time, he knew that there was no other choice. They had to start focusing on the next step now, which was delivering the baby. There was no doubt in Matthew's mind that Britta would have preferred the birth to be as natural as possible, but this didn't seem possible. There was no way that his wife could push the baby out in this state. They were forced to go for a C-section operation on Britta, with all the risks included that this could bring. The surgical operation was scheduled 3 weeks from now, as this was closer to Britta's due date. Waiting 3 weeks would give the baby the optimal chance of coming to the world as healthy as possible, according to the experts present. This would not pose any extra risks for Britta's well-being. For Matthew, however, it was different. The following 21 days were absolute hell for Matthew. He tried to go about life as normal as possible in this period by going to work in his normal routine and by watching sports on the TV when he got home. Unfortunately, he could not function normally at all, as his mind constantly wandered to the baby and his wife in the coma. Matthew hardly slept the first week with his mind being in such a worried state. After 5 days of trying to go to work, he decided that it would be best for himself as well as for his co-workers to take a few weeks off. This meant that he could spend every day alongside his wife, just watching over her and praying for things to turn out all right. Then, the day arrived that the operation would take place after the 3 weeks, although for Matthew it felt as if 3 months had gone by. Britta had stayed very stable during the waiting process, and the doctors determined that she was in a good enough condition for the surgical operation to be executed. Matthew could barely breathe. Although the waiting time was long, the operation itself only took about half an hour. It was such a standard procedure for this team that the surgeons could almost do it blindfolded. The fact that Britta did not need any further anesthetics speeded up the process even more. Matthew was watching everything closely from behind the glass. When the surgical part was over, Matthew was allowed to enter the operation room. It was absolutely surreal for him to hold his first child, his son, in his arms. He had just become a father, and this realization made him forget the world around him for a few seconds. In the background, however, there was still his wife with whom the surgeons were finishing up. When Matthew got back to reality, it was almost becoming too much for him to handle. Was he allowed to feel any joy before this was over? Still, he knew exactly what his wife would want him to do in this situation. He needed to be there for the baby with all his energy till she would wake up again. The rest of the surgery went very successful, and it was soon finished. Britta, still in coma, was wheeled back into her room on the rolling bed. Matthew was slowly and carefully following her, together with an accompanying nurse and his newborn son. He decided to take a picture of his wife and child while they were both sleeping. Now that the operation went as planned, Matthew had a bit more space in his head to think about this particular moment. He knew that Britta would appreciate it if he'd capture this moment, even though she actually never experienced the moment, and in all likelihood she never would again. It felt strange for him to take this picture with his phone, as there was no telling what would happen next. Britta had been fast asleep for so long that Matthew felt uncertain about the future. If there was any risk of his wife having to go through this ordeal again, then their newborn son would surely stay an only child, unless they would consider adoption. When Matthew was thinking about this in his head, the nurse that had helped him during the C-section wanted to talk to him. She then explained that his wife had to be kept in the coma for at least a week and possibly longer so that the doctors could conclude with certainty that Britta would be strong enough to be woken up again. It shocked Matthew somewhat because just before the operation they had told him that the waiting was going to take a maximum of 1 week. He and his baby did not leave the hospital except for when they were sleeping in the hospital hotel. He rarely left his wife out of sight during these days, patiently waiting for how the situation would develop. After exactly 1 week, the day finally arrived. Matthew's doubt and worries made way for a ton of optimism. The doctors had told him that they were very positive about Britta's physical condition and that she would soon wake up just fine. Matthew realized that they'd not yet decided on a name, so this would be first order of business. And so it happened a couple of hours later. A team of 2 doctors and 2 nurses was assembled to safely proceed the operation involving an injection with the necessary medical concoction that Britta would need. Britta listened to the rest of the explanation before asking to see her baby. She was eager to meet him. While the nurse headed out, Matthew was glad to show her the pictures he had taken with the baby while Britta was still in a coma. Britta watched as Matthew swiped through the pictures, her eyes soaked in tears while she stared at the pictures. Finally, the nurse returned with the baby. Britta watched in silent tears as the nurse carried the baby into the room. It was so tiny and fragile, it seemed her entire world was changing as she stared at her baby. Britta, like Matthew, could not believe how much happiness the baby brought to her heart. For the moment at least. The rest of the day went by quickly as the doctor ran tests on Britta to make sure she was in good health. After the tests were done, the family was told that both mother and son would need to be observed for another day, and Matthew used the time to ease his wife into the changes that had occurred. But little did they know that they were in for a greater shock. The day for checkout came and both Britta and the baby were given a clean bill of health. They would need to come back to the hospital in the following months for scheduled checkups to ensure there were no oddities or side effects from the operation. The family was now ready to begin their life together, or so they thought. The next couple of weeks seemed to move by quickly for the young family. Their number one priority was getting back to normal. First, they named their young baby Hope to show what he meant to them. For both Britta and Matthew, the most important thing was being the best parents to Hope. But normalcy meant facing a difficult decision. Matthew had to head back to work. He had maxed out his vacation and sick leave, which meant he would be leaving his wife and baby alone. Although Matthew understood it was necessary, it was difficult separating from them. He also couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something would go wrong in his absence. However, as time went by, the feeling eased and Matthew could spend time at work with little worry for the well-being of Britta and Hope. Soon, 50 days had gone by since their initial release from the hospital. It was now time for Hope to have his first checkup post-delivery, but were they ready for the results? For Matthew and Britta, observing Hope daily made them confident in his health, but they knew that the circumstance of his delivery put their son at a greater risk of falling gravely ill. But luckily, the doctor co-signed their thoughts, echoing that the baby was indeed healthy and hearty. The visit lasted a short 10 minutes and the couple was on their way out when things took a turn. The couple was making their way out of the doctor's office when they ran into their nurse, the one who had cared for Britta during and after her coma. She leaned in to ask about Britta. Hope was getting uncomfortable as he started to whine. Matthew said his goodbyes to the nurse and took Hope out for fresh air, leaving Britta to speak with the nurse privately. Matthew stood outside as he rocked Hope to sleep, his mind focused on calming the baby. He wondered when Britta would return, but he didn't have to wait long. Britta was back 10 minutes later. She remained silent for much of the ride back. Matthew smiled genially, having no idea what had just been set in motion at the hospital. The next few days went by uneventfully. The family had settled into a comfortable routine. The baby was healthy and so was Britta, and all seemed blissful. Then a few days later, things took an unexpected turn when they received an alarming call. It was the hospital and things were not good. It was the doctor's assistant. Matthew had only spoken to the man a few times. He had been nice and professional in the past. Matthew imagined very little worried someone with his background, but this time his voice seemed unsettled. He informed Matthew that he, Britta, and Hope would need to come to the hospital as soon as possible. This worried Matthew. He asked if he could be given some more information, but the assistant explained that for legal purposes he would need to see the doctor to get the information he needed, and encouraged him to come in at the earliest. Seeing no other way around it, Matthew immediately called Britta to relay the information. Britta agreed, and the couple decided they would go visit the doctor on that day. Rushing home after work, Matthew picked up Britta, and the three of them headed straight to the hospital. Matthew could only feel the panic in himself as they drew closer to the hospital. But in contrast, Britta seemed oddly calm. Matthew tried not to focus on Britta's odd reaction to the situation, but it bothered him that she remained calm while there was a possibility that their son's health was in danger. The further they rattled, the more rattled by her composure Matthew became. Did she know something he didn't? It seemed to Matthew that they had been on the road forever. Finally, they arrived at the hospital and rushed in to check themselves. Once they introduced themselves at reception, they were immediately escorted to a secluded room at the end of the hall. Inside, someone waited for them. The couple was face to face with the main doctor who had treated Britta while she was in a coma. But he wasn't alone. On his side was the nurse Matthew had left to speak with Britta over a week ago. This time, he could see the clear look of worry on her face. It suddenly occurred to Matthew that perhaps Britta was the one who was ill. The doctor watched as Matthew grew pale and turned to assess his wife. Quickly, he interjected, seeing where the young man's thoughts were headed. He explained that there was in fact nothing wrong with the health of Bao, his wife, and their baby. At least not physically. In fact, they had debated whether or not getting involved was their place. Matthew was glad to hear that Britta was doing okay, and so was the baby. But the tone and look the doctor and nurse were exchanging did not help to ease his worries. Then the doctor continued, they were here today to discuss an issue that Britta had raised in her conversation with the nurse. Britta had confided in the nurse that because she had not been conscious of the birth of their son, she felt detached from the baby. She had hoped the feeling would pass, but it had only festered. Matthew was stunned. This was the first he was hearing of this. Turning to Britta, he searched her face for a denial, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Lord. Matthew realized that the doctor was right. Britta was truly going through this. The doctor explained that it was entirely normal for many women to experience this, especially after a delivery like hers. It was also an entirely solvable problem, which was why they had asked the family to come in today. The doctor had spoken with a few of the hospital therapists about the situation, and they explained that Britta could start free therapy sessions as soon as possible. The family was grateful and Britta signed up for single and family therapy sessions. Together, the young family worked towards healing the emotional scar. Luckily, their hard work paid off. As the weeks went by, Matthew could see the progress in both Britta and Hope. It was clear the mother and child had begun to grow their bond. He was extremely thankful to the doctor and nurse who had set up the sessions, as he felt their family could finally move past the pain from the ordeal.